Hello there, dear listener. Tonight we drift back in time to a misty lagoon where salt-tinged breezes curl around your ankles, and wooden stakes whisper beneath your feet. You probably didn't imagine that someday you'd find yourself nestled among reeds, peering at flame-kissed furnaces rising above clusters of palafit dwellings. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on a narrow, winding canal in the early Middle Ages, before even the glint of doges or gondolas. Smoke curls upward from battered chimneys, and you can almost taste the acrid mix of burning firewood and the faint tang of lime plaster. Imagine standing on a plank walkway between wooden piers, leaning toward a row of simple brick kilns. This is where the first Venetian glass workshops took root. Venetian glassmaking truly began around the 8th century when artisans were moved to the islands of Murano to protect mainland wooden structures from the risk of fire. By the 12th century, these artisans had already gained a reputation far beyond the lagoon, sending shards of transparent wonder across the Mediterranean. As you step closer to the heat, the glow from molten glass pools in your vision, reminding you that you're witnessing something remarkable. Mainstream historical fact shows that Murano became the epicenter for all glass production in the Venetian Republic, the Serenissima, by 1291, when the Venetian Senate ordered all furnaces removed from the mainland, ostensibly to prevent catastrophic fires, but also to consolidate control over this prized craft. You might feel the tickle of curiosity as you sense that these decisions laid the foundation for centuries of exquisite artistry. Yet the story has a quieter, quirkier undercurrent. Some scribes from antiquity whisper that early Venetian glassmakers used crushed snail shells in their mixtures to achieve a curious iridescence. Imagine that delicate shimmer, like the throat of a hummingbird frozen in molten clarity. Whether the snail shells produced more sheen or smelled worse is up for debate, but you can almost hear the softly cracking shells tumbling into the crucible. Historians still argue whether the use of snail shells was widespread or just the fancy of a few eccentric masters, but it adds a playful counterpoint to the more straightforward clay and lime descriptions you might find in thicker history books. You might notice that at first, glass production in the lagoon was rudimentary: small pieces, rough edges, functional vessels for storing oil and wine. But these early craftsmen had bigger dreams. Their ambition sparked a transformation from plain drinking glasses to jeweled beads and, eventually, intricate mosaic tesserae. Imagine a humble potter's wheel redesigned for glassblowing, a blowpipe dipping into a glowing orb, gathering a gob of molten liquid that shimmers like molten moonlight. As you step even closer, you realize the workshop smells of oily flaxseed and pine resin, used to season tools and add a subtle golden sheen to some glass formulae. The master glassmaker taps a metal paddle on the glowing orb, shaping a small vial for sacred oils. You can almost close your eyes and sense the rhythmic whoosh as the glassblower puffs gently, coaxing the flux of sand, soda ash, and lime into a symmetric bubble. That bubble will become so much more, a fragment in a future mosaic, carrying the light of stained windows across cathedral chapels. And yet, this pioneering era wasn't without hierarchy and rivalry. Master craftsmen wielded subtle forms of social power. Passport-like seals marked the output of each workshop, ensuring that Venetian glass stayed precious. Even neighboring cities admired the speeding trade caravans rowed by cloaked bargemen carrying brilliant beads and vials. By the time you can trace the reflection of torchlight dancing across canal waters, you sense that every bead, no matter how small, carries the weight of political strategy and mercantile ambition. As local legend claims, one early master buried shards of experimental glass beneath a cypress tree to test how soil moisture affected cooling times. That tiny arcane experiment reminds you that medieval glassmaking was as much science as it was art. And you wonder, if he had just skipped to the next needed lime formula, how many morning veils or wedding goblets might have taken on a different hue? Historians still argue whether such trial-and-error mineshafts beneath trees actually happened, but the notion still hums among collectors. You might hear rumors of Byzantine emissaries, their garments rustling, arriving by ferry to inspect new techniques being born right here in the lagoon. They whispered about clarity rivaling rock crystal and gold threads embedded in glass that glowed even candlelit. That curiosity fueled the Venetians to experiment more daringly, layering glass, blending metallic oxides, and experimenting with rare sands. Night breezes carry faint strains of chanting monks from a distant abbey, reminding you that glass wasn't just luxury goods, it carried religious significance, too, to spice up stained glass windows. And right now, you're standing at that pivot point, the unassuming beginnings of Venetian glass workshops, where boozy breath of apprentices mingled with glints of molten substrate. You might see an apprentice, fingers scorched, kneading fresh clay to shape a new furnace ring, all while the master explains how to read the color changes in molten metal oxides. His deep voice hums, red means too hot, purple means the cobalt is dancing, a delicate balance. You feel transported, toes gently dangling above muddy waters. No one yet whispered about golden mosaics across cathedral walls or mirrored grand palazzo floors. All they saw was a handful of coals glowing under a clay roof and a craftsman's soft exhalations as he puffed life into a shimmering bubble. Yet in that moment, everything changed. The environment crackled with potential, a few secrets in furnace design, a few hidden recipes for color, and a fiercely guarded location that would shield these precious techniques from prying eyes. As you lean back on a rough-hewn bench, the soothing hum of lagoon waves reminds you that even the grandest creations begin in humble shelters. Those early workshops were no bigger than a large barn, but they housed the spark of innovation that would ripple out across Europe and beyond. While you listen to the faint clinking of metal tools being stoked by apprentices, you recall that this is just the opening verse of a longer ballad, one that leads us toward shimmering mosaics. Opulent cathedrals, and jeweled churches. Historians still argue whether that first decision to relocate all furnaces to Murano was purely about fire prevention or cleverly engineered to keep secrets within a single island community. But tonight, you're wrapped in the warmth of that question, drifting closer to sleep as you imagine a flickering hearth, a master holding molten dreams on the end of a pipe, and a solitary snail shell tumbling into a crucible. You drift closer to the edge of the workshop, noticing how the air seems to brim with tiny particles that sparkle, almost like distant stars caught in torchlight. Beneath your feet, wooden planks sealed with layers of tar creak as a gentle breeze stirred up a fine dust. This is the dust of Murano's secret, sand and silica harvested from the Venetian lagoon. You probably thought all sand was the same, a bland, beige backdrop for tiny castles, but here, it's its own alchemy, the source of glimmering miracles. In hushed tones, the master glassmaker explains that the best glass begins with sand from the riverbeds of the Brenta and Piave rivers, carried down from the Dolomites. Ancient records show that by the 13th century, Venetian merchants caravaned sacks of this white, almost translucent sand to Murano specifically for glass production. It was prized for its high quartz content, over 99% pure quartz, in fact, meaning fewer impurities to darken the glass. As you strain to see the grainy pebbles, you realize these tiny crystals would one day become vases so clear they could pass for plucked ice, but there's more hidden in that dust than meets the eye. Some of the lagoon's sediment carried trace amounts of iron and manganese, which medieval glassmakers learned to tame, or exploit, to achieve delicate greenish and amber tones. Think of it like cooking, where a dash of salt transforms an entire dish. The earliest Venetian glass was actually categorized by its clarity. The famous Cristallo glass was nearly colorless, compared to earlier, muddier wares imported from the Levant. You can almost taste the salty tang in the air, as if each breath carries a promise of luminous goblets and shimmering beads. You shift your weight, and for a moment, a small cloud of silted dust rises, coating the master's boots with a thin, white veneer. He chuckles softly, noticing your fascination, and says, "You see, this sand is not just sand, it's floating alchemy." gathered at low tide when the lagoon's currents shift, then sifted through little reed mats to separate the fine grains from coarse pebbles. His voice is low, almost a whisper, as though revealing a secret to lull you into dreams. In truth, Venetians had been collecting this silica-rich sand since before the Republic's golden age, repurposing it for mortar, plaster, and, eventually, glass. As you gaze at those piles of fine sediment, you might notice tiny black specks glinting among the quartz. At first glance, you think it's dirt, but the master points and says, "Ah, those are fragments of volcanic glass, obsidian, that drifted down from distant volcanoes, perhaps from the Aeolian Islands." They lend a sharper focus to the material, helping the master of color achieve sharper, more translucent hues. Somehow, that detail feels almost mythical, volcanic shards carried miles away by wind and water, mingling with river sand to create something entirely new, yet the story has an even quirkier angle. An old semi-legend account suggests that in times of scarcity, some glassmakers dredged the lagoon itself, scooping up sand that had settled near old shipwrecks. These shipwreck sands carried traces of animal fats from rotting cargo or metallic alloys from copper fittings. While you might imagine the glass smelling faintly of brine or iron, the master says that these odd contaminants sometimes yielded eerie opalescent swirls that became prized by a few experimental craftsmen. In a world before modern chemical labs, this kind of random chance was part of the excitement, finding an unexpected ripple or flash of color in raw materials that would otherwise be discarded. You might imagine the monumental effort it took to move these sands. By midday, when the sun hovered directly above the lagoon, a group of paddlers pushed a small barge to a shallow, sheltered basin near Murano. They piled the braided reed mats knee-high, waiting for the outgoing tide to carry away finer silt. When the tide receded, they scraped the sun-baked sand into wooden wheelbarrows and trundled it back to the workshop. You can almost feel their muscles straining, their shirts damp with sweat, and taste the salt that crusted their lips. This is not romantic leisure, it's gritty, essential labor that separates legends from daydreams. Inside the workshop, apprentices slide wooden sieves across rough-hewn tables, dancing the sand back and forth until not a speck of twig or shell remains. The master invites you to touch a handful. Grains sift through your fingers like rough sugar, yet some feel almost smooth, like tiny shards of glass themselves. You're struck by how tactile this process is, how, wordlessly, each apprentice learns to listen for the faint rustle of pure silica, discarding anything that rustles dull or crumbly. Over time, Venice secured rights to exclusive sand collection zones along the lagoon's northern reaches. These concessions were carefully guarded. Records from 1400 show that unauthorized sand sellers might face hefty fines or even public shaming, their heads shaved and paraded through the Rialto market. This intermingling of politics and raw materials reminds you that glass wasn't just an art, it was an economic powerhouse. Merchants knew that if this specific sand leaked southward, say, to competitors in Florence or Genoa, the monopoly would crumble. And even today, you can sense how fiercely Venetians guarded that advantage. But let's explore another fringe detail. There are tales in old Venetian chronicles about a morbid curiosity. Some glassmakers believed that sand submerged near the cloisters of San Michele Island, where skeletons were buried, carried an ethereal shimmer. Of course, no one dared dig near bones, but initiates whispered that the mere thought of ghostly sand swirling in crucibles lent the glass otherworldly brilliance. It's hard to verify if anyone actually risked such grave robbing, but the legend endures whenever a master achieves a particularly haunting translucence, one that seems to glow from within, as if lit by candlelight trapped in stone, as the sun begins its slow descent. You notice beams of golden light filtering through workshops, illuminating ancient barrels filled with crushed purity. The master explains that while the purest white sands came upstream, they sometimes blended it, in small batches, with coarser dune sand scavenged from the Venice, Lido barrier islands. That coarser sand was less uniform but added texture, helping to anchor the delicate crystalline structure when heated. You breathe in again, and the scent of wet wood and brine feels almost medicinal, something that, if you inhale too long, might beckon sleep deeper than any lullaby. In the corner, a small pile of powdered lime sits waiting. Mixed with silica, it lowers the melting point of the sand, allowing craftsmen to maintain lower, more stable temperatures, a critical factor for medieval furnaces burning wood alone. You watch as an apprentice hefts a clay jar of powdered soda ash, derived from local sea plants burned to ash in salt pans, and sprinkles it over the sand. They speak of the precise ratios: too little ash and the glass remains too brittle, too much, and it turns opaque and crumbly. Balance, the master says, is the soul of our craft. The words drift to you like a soft sigh, and you wonder how many sleepless nights he spent perfecting this recipe. Meanwhile, down at the canal's edge, you glimpse stooped laborers gathering wild bramble plants. When burned, the bramble thorns yield a faintly colored ash, prized by a handful of radical glassmakers in the 14th century who experimented with strange, smoky hues. Though most masters dismissed this as folly, a few managed to inject deep amber swirls into their mosaic tiles, swirls some say resemble drifting clouds at dusk. You can imagine these patterns catching light in a dim chapel, creating shifting shadows that feel almost hypnotic. When your eyes drift back toward the halos of light around each crucible, you notice something extraordinary: tiny flecks of gold, mingled with the sand by a particularly audacious master. Venetian alchemists had discovered how to split gold into flakes, pulvis aurum, then mix it sparingly into molten glass to create the fabled gold ruby effect. While this technique truly peaked later, traces of it appear as early as the late 13th century, when a few European palaces coveted glasses so red they seemed to glow like embers. The wild thing is that achieving that color required an almost microscopic balance: too much gold and the glass turned dark, too little and the effect fizzled. Just a pinch in the sand and lime mixture transformed ordinary sand into a canvas for molten jewelry. At this stage, you begin to sense that sand and silica are more than raw materials, they're storytellers. Each batch carries whispered memories of distant mountains, volcanic eruptions, and shifting tides. With every handful that glides through an apprentice's sieve, you feel connected to an alchemy of time, space, and human hands. The lagoon's saltwater breath is an ever-present reminder: no one else in Europe could replicate this glass so perfectly. You might feel a subtle tension, an understanding that somewhere, not too far away, rival glassmakers were desperately sending spies disguised as merchants to glean even a pinch of those sands. But for now, you sit back on a nearby crate, letting the cool dusk air wash over you as the last light schemes off white sand piles. Farther out on the canal, gondoliers guide sleek boats laden with casks of sand toward distant workshops. The rhythmic lapping of water against hulls harmonizes with the soft clink of sieves, and together they compose a lullaby meant for your drifting mind. You can sense the day's work winding down. Apprentices carefully seal wheelbarrows of pure sand with waxed cloth, while the master scribbles last-minute notes on a scrap of parchment, perhaps the first inklings of tomorrow's recipe. And yet, there's a final whisper. Some say that a few enterprising glassmakers secretly pocketed the choicest sand, stashing it in hidden footlockers to sell at a premium to eager nobles outside the lagoon. In exchange, these nobles might offer foreign manuscripts on chemical processes, or rare animal horns ground into powder, promising new colors never seen before in Europe. It's a shady trade, of course, and rarely discussed aloud, but legends tell of foot chases down Fondamenta streets when a ship's captain discovered such contraband. As night settles, you trace the silhouette of a young apprentice carefully refilling burlap sacks with silica. Her fingertips tremble with reverence. She knows this grainy treasure holds the promise of tomorrow's masterpiece. You lean in to glance at her task, feeling a shared anticipation. Soon, these sands will surrender their hidden secrets to a roaring fire, and the cycle will begin anew. A cool breeze drifts past. You close your eyes, letting the combined scent of lagoon water, sun-warmed sand, and burning wood lull you a step closer to sleep. You can almost hear that famous glassmaker's lullaby, the sizzle of sand hitting the crucible, the soft clang of a metal disc against molten glass, and the low, contented hum of perfected fire. In this moment, you realize that every masterpiece begins here, with humble grains of sand shining like forgotten stars in the glow of a half-lit workshop. You breathe in the dusk-tinged air, still heavy with lingering ash from late afternoon fires, and follow a narrow flagstone path to the heart of the workshop where the furnaces stand like silent guardians. Each oven is built from deep red brick, blackened at the base from centuries of glowing embers. You probably assumed a furnace was simply a hollow kiln, but here, the secrets lie in subtle details, arched vents, hidden flues, and chambers that trap heat in just the right way. Lean close, and you'll feel the radiant warmth waver against your cheeks, like a steadfast breath coaxing the embers to life. Mainstream historical fact tells us that medieval Venetian furnaces reached temperatures of around 1,200 to 1,400 degrees Celsius, high enough to melt silica into a fluid state suitable for glassblowing. These temperatures were astonishing for a time when thermometers didn't exist, and wood was the only fuel at hand. Merchants and city officials recognized the necessity of keeping these fires separate from wooden residences, which is why, in 1291, all glass workshops were legally moved to Murano. But even within that safety measure, masters continued to push their ovens to the brink, refining designs that had been passed down since the 11th century. You might notice that each furnace's dome curves gently upward, and peeking inside, you see staggered rafters that create a bell shape, maximizing internal air circulation. Apprentices kneel beside the arched entrance, gently fanning coals with handheld bellows crafted from cured goat hide. The rhythmic whoosh, whoosh sound is almost meditative, a gentle heartbeat to which the glass world pulses. Sparks drift upward like golden fireflies as embers collapse and reignite in a dance you can almost feel in your chest. The joke among apprentices is that a master's true skill reveals itself not just in shaping glass but in how he controls the furnace's breathing. Too much air, and the flames roar so fiercely they crack newly laid bricks; too little, and the heat wanes, producing glass as dull as fog. You watch an older craftsman, his face flushed from years of tending fires, adjusting a small iron draft plate inside a vent. With a subtle click, he seals the arched opening, sealing in just enough smoke so that the fire glows a fierce, deep red. As the plate slides shut, the interior temperature spikes, and you can almost taste the sharp note of wood smoke mixed with resin. Yet beneath this practiced facade lies a fringe theory. Some workshop lore claims that a handful of masters hid tiny shards of volcanic rock, pumice or scoria, deep within the furnace walls, believing these fragments absorbed impurities and produced a steadier burn. It's hard to prove, but if you brush your fingers across the heat-blackened bricks, you might feel a faint roughness, as if those stones remain embedded. Over centuries, the occasional spark of obsidian or grit disrupted a batch of glass, lending just enough unpredictability that some creators spoke of living furnaces. Some nights, they whispered, sparks would swirl like fire dancers, as if the furnace itself was alive. You step closer and realize the floors around each furnace are also lined with a mixture of sand and powdered limestone. Apprentices sweep these layers into tidy piles, both to catch stray embers and to help regulate heat. The sand acts as a natural insulator. No one wanted to wake up to a workshop ablaze, so they built up a shallow bed of sand that absorbed any hot coals that tumbled out. You might picture a rogue ember slipping from a crucible, rolling across the floor, and hissing gently as it hit the cool sand, only to smolder and die in a few moments. Inside the central dome, a semicircular alcove holds a crucible, often made of refractory clay, mixed with crushed glass shards called cullet. The cullet helped the furnace maintain higher temperatures more consistently by providing nucleation points for new glass to form. You feel the heat stroke your cheeks as you imagine just how precarious this operation was. An apprentice might add fresh logs, causing the fire to flare unpredictably, and the master would place his hand on the furnace door to read the heat, gauging the hue of the glowing brick, deep orange, blood red, or glowing white, all signs that the furnace has reached the perfect working temperature. A quirky detail emerges. Some masters believe that certain herbs, when pressed between brick seams, imparted aromatic qualities to the fire, subtly affecting the glass's color. One such herb was rosemary, supposedly planted around the workshop to drive away evil spirits and remind workers to maintain a steady wind of inspiration. You might imagine the faint perfume of rosemary mingling with smoke, a scent so subtle you doubt it's real until an apprentice brushes past and you catch a fresh waft of pine-like fragrance. No one wrote this in official records, but whispers claim that rosemary coexisted with other magical ingredients, like chalk from ancient tombs, meant to encourage a steadfast flame, watching an apprentice stoke the fire with slender beams of alder wood. You sense how every wooden log was chosen with care. Alder wood burned cleanly and steadily, producing a deep orange flame that remained calmer than oak or pine. Some masters even hoarded their own private supply, stored in lofts above the workshop, to ensure a pure burn. When a rival glassmaker peered over the concierge wall in hopes of discovering fuel sources, the master would roll his eyes and tap the handle of his tongs as if the secret lay in his very bones. Historians still argue whether the legendary bellows of Aquileia, rumored to generate wind so fierce it could raise temperatures by 50 degrees in mere minutes, ever existed. Some say these bellows were myth, passed down from generation to bolster morale during lean winters. Others claim the Aquileian bellows were real, massive leather contraptions with intricate brass nozzles that drew fresh air from hidden vents beneath workshops. No physical trace remains, but when you watch an apprentice pump his bellows, you can almost hear the distant echo of those grand machines, pushing air with an urgency that felt revolutionary to medieval craftsmen. You notice that even at twilight, the furnaces remain active. A small pile of alder wood sits nearby, pre-split to specific lengths, about 1 foot each, allowing for consistent burn times. The apprentice fits one piece into a slender opening at the back, poking it forward until the glowing edge meets the coals. The log sizzles theatrically, sending a brief flurry of sparks into the air. The master leans in, shading his eyes, and nods approvingly as the flames rise to a dancing crescendo. The rhythm of the workshop feels almost musical, the hiss of steam from quenching hot metal, the creak of wooden pegs holding heavy doors, the low rumble as gravity draws fresh sand into waiting sluices. And throughout this sensory tapestry, the furnaces themselves remain the heartbeat. Each one stands on 4 sturdy piers, raising it slightly above the ground to allow air to feed from beneath, a design inspired by furnace blueprints from Constantinople, shared by visiting Byzantine emissaries eager to nurture trade ties. Yet, even within this practiced structure, accidents happened. Apprentices tell of a young boy who, in his eagerness, shoved too many logs at once. The blast of flame cracked one furnace's dome, sending a chunk of brick catapulting into the courtyard. Legends say that brick flew so far that it landed by the canal's edge, where gondoliers found it the next morning, cold and cracked. They dubbed it the Phoenix brick, believing that the moment it shattered in midair, it marked a new era of vigilance among glassmakers. You stroll behind the ovens to where vats of water wait, their surfaces rippling from gentle drafts. Once a batch of glass was de-emphasized or too hot to handle, masters would dunk metal rods into these vats, generating a soft hiss as molten glass cooled rapidly. This frosting technique allowed craftsmen to shape glass more precisely, giving each piece a smooth, velvety sheen. You might imagine a rod of molten crimson glass immersed in water, steam dancing in white plumes as the rod emerges, hardened to a crisp clarity that no kiln cooling could replicate. Amid this carefully choreographed activity, you notice a peculiar contraption, a small, wheel-driven clay blower, almost like an oversized hamster wheel, operated by a barefoot apprentice who pushes it with his toes. This device fed a continuous stream of air into the furnace, eliminating pauses in the flame. It's a fringe innovation. Some say it was inspired by early water-driven mills along the Brenta River, that allowed glassblowers to maintain stasis in flame intensity for hours on end. The master's gaze flicks toward that will every so often, ensuring the boy's rhythm doesn't falter. "Steady wins the race," he mutters, eyes half closed. As you stand back, observing the gentle arcing flames, your vision might wander to see iron tools laid across wooden benches, shears, tweezers, and pincer-like blocks, each bearing charred spots from intense heat. Apprentices donned leather gloves, stitched with linen patches, letting them handle glowing crucibles for mere seconds. You're struck by the delicate choreography. If any tool fell, it could shatter envy-worthy glass, jeopardize a master's reputation, or worse, ignite scattered logs on the floor. In the murmur of the dying day, you perceive a subtle tension. Rivals in Florence and Bohemia would pay handsomely for a scrap of Venetian furnace blueprint or a sample of those legendary pumice-laced bricks. Rumor has it that Venetian officials once caught a disguised Florentine spy dilly-dallying by the workshop entrance, clutching a rolled-up scroll scribbled with guesses about furnace drafts. They escorted him to the Doge's palace, and by sunrise, the gates of Florence bore a sealed letter, listing demands for explanation or face economic sanctions. While historians still argue whether that tale is pure legend or a matter of record, it underscores the high stakes of furnace secrets in an age where knowledge was as prized as treasure. You return to the warmth of the bright flames, feeling the heat radiate through your sleeves and cook your mind with fascination. Apprentices pause just long enough to admire the sweet spot of burning embers, beneath a slight ridge in the oven's brickwork, where flames occasionally split into twin tongues, dancing like serene ghosts. Some masters claimed this ridge was placed there deliberately, shaping airflow to make the fire breathe in a mesmerizing rhythm. You can practically see that rhythm now, the flickering shadows skimming across grimy walls, beckoning you to settle in. Suddenly, from a back alcove, a hulking leather-bound hourglass swings gently, grains of sand trickling steadily, a rudimentary thermostat. When the sand empties, an apprentice opens the furnace vent a notch, letting fresh oxygen rush in. This simple device let craftsmen time their shifts of bellows, ensuring a constant feeding schedule. Staring at that hourglass, you marvel that such an elegant solution, turning glass to measure itself, was conceived at a time when so many secrets were buried beneath layers of guild codes. You step away, the roaring chorus of heat gradually dimming as evening sets. The master grips his metal rod and pulls forth a glowing orb, liquid as candle flame. Even in this twilight moment, the furnace's legacy is clear, a combination of practical engineering, guarded alchemical lore, and a dash of eccentric flair. Each ember hums with centuries-old wisdom, inviting you to drift into a world where fire is not merely a tool but a silent, pulsing companion in the art of glass. And as the last embers glow, and the hourglass reaches its silent end, you find yourself lulled by the soft contrast between flame's roar and looming shadows. The secrets of the medieval furnaces are no longer just technicalities, they're tiny lullabies woven into the fabric of Venetian glassmaking, cradle songs meant to fuel your dreams of molten wonders dancing into shape. You step away from the glowing embers and drift toward a tight courtyard enclosed by low, crumbling walls where the midday sun filters down through swaying banners. The air here feels different, thick with hushed murmurs, the clinking of metal seals, and the faint aroma of beeswax seeping from a freshly stamped parchment. This is the nexus where artisans begin to transcend the solitude of their solitary furnaces and coalesce into something more formidable, the glass guilds. You probably assumed guilds were mere clubs for shared gossip, but in medieval Venice, these confraternities operated like treasure vaults of ancient secrets, ironclad loyalty oaths, and whispered threats for betrayal. In the 13th century, Venetian glassmakers formally organized into the Arte dei Vetrari, a powerful guild sanctioned by the Doge himself. Historical records note that by 1280, this guild regulated every aspect of glass production, from who could apprentice under a master to precise measurements for color recipes. It was more than a social club, it was effectively a state-sponsored union, ensuring that no apprentice took home a single panino with a scrap of silica still clinging to his tunic. Now, as you lean on a time-worn pillar, you sense their collective authority, a group that dictated prices, surveyed outgoing exports, and even influenced patrician families' commissions. You watch as 5 masters, each wearing long, dark robes stitched with tiny glass beads, gather around a makeshift table draped in velvet. Their faces glow under torchlight, revealing lines etched by decades of fanning furnaces and puffing breath into molten orbs. A hush falls as one of them, the most venerable among them, lifts a wooden gavel carved from olive wood. The grain is polished to a soft sheen after countless knocks, and you can almost feel its smooth weight in your hand. He wraps it carefully, and the meeting begins in low tones, each sentence weighed with consequence. Their tradition demands that only accredited masters may speak, and any deviation risks expulsion. Behind them, on a rough-hewn wall, scrolls of cloth hang, inscribed with rules about labor division. No glass shall be sold at an unauthorized market, reads one decree, nor shall any technique be taught to foreign hands. Apprentices hover near the edges, their eyes flicking between masters, hoping to catch a nugget of arcane lore. You can almost hear their hearts thumping, minds racing with ambition. If they prove themselves, perhaps they'll earn the coveted cordon around their waist, signifying full guild membership. Yet, beneath this veneer of solemnity, a quirky fringe detail emerges. Whispers circulate that some masters secretly tattooed miniature symbols of a glass-blowing pipe on their apprentices' left wrists, inked with grapevine sap and powdered malachite pigment, so they could identify runaway craftsmen if they ever tried to escape to Florence. The rumor goes that those tattoos glowed faintly under moonlight, betraying any errant apprentice who had hoped to slip through canal shadows unnoticed. Whether this was true or just a bedtime story to scare novices into obedience remains unconfirmed, but it adds a mischievous glimmer to an otherwise austere ceremony. You sidle up to one of the apprentices, feeling a bit guilty for eavesdropping, but his face lights up when he notices your interest. They're here to settle a dispute about lagoon taxes on sand shipments, he whispers. It's ironic, sand and silica, the very foundation of glass, is now at the heart of bureaucratic wrangling. The apprentice explains that the Doge recently imposed a new levy on sand haulers near Burano, and the guild fears these fees will ripple through costs, forcing masters to raise prices for patricians. You can almost taste the tension. The aroma of beeswax mingles with a faint tang of sweat as the apprentice lowers his voice, as if fearing that the very walls might report him. Quietly, you recall the master in Section 2 who insisted on absolute purity of sand. Now, you realize that those pristine grains had become such a valuable commodity that even Venetian officials quarreled over their rightful ownership. It's as if the sand itself bears witness to political intrigue, formulating alliances and betrayals as easily as it glides through an apprentice's sieve. And yet, amid this regal politicking, there's an unspoken code. Masters will not speak the full truth if it jeopardizes a colleague's livelihood. Instead, they veil decisions in a web of half-phrases and furtive glances. Glancing upward, you notice a fresco just above a carved wooden balcony, a triumphant scene of Saint Barbara, patroness of architects and builders, holding a cluster of glass tesserae that glow like celestial stars. Painting hands chipped away centuries ago, but the colors still shimmer faintly, suggesting that someone once believed the guild's endeavors blessed by divine providence. You might imagine apprentices praying to her, offering small tokens, perhaps a single glass bead or a scrap of crimson glass, left before the fresco in hopes of channeling extra luck to their furnaces. As the masters debate over parchments, one taps his quill on a leather-bound ledger, striking up a delicate rhythm that resonates throughout the courtyard. The sound is oddly soothing, like raindrops on clay, and you almost drift in time with it, the scratch and tap punctuating your breath. The debate over taxes seems to stretch on, but no matter, the real action happens in sidelong glances, the discreet passing of tiny scrolls rolled and sealed with wax. You catch a glimpse. It's a note promising a secret meeting at night near the Rialto Bridge to discuss a new recipe rumored to produce an even paler, frost-like glass. One master glances your way, and for a split second, you feel the weight of his gaze as if you're standing on a precipice between permission and prohibition. He seems pleased by your curiosity and nods ever so slightly before turning back to hashing out details about apprenticeship quotas. You marvel at the complexity. These glass guilds orchestrate everything, from shades of cobalt to the number of children allowed to train in a single workshop. Under the Doge's watchful approval, you sidestep to a nearby niche where a wooden chest rests, its surface scarred by countless iron keys jingling like tiny chimes. The chest holds the Libro dei Segreti, a collection of manuscripts, sketches, and fragmented notes detailing variations on glass recipes. Apprentices are strictly forbidden from touching it until they've completed at least 5 years of service. And even then only under a master's direct supervision. Curiously, some entries are written in a cipher known only to the heads of the guild, a swirling, almost illegible script that might look like a child's scribble if you weren't told otherwise. They say that cracking the cipher requires a profound understanding of labyrinthine logic, arcane symbols, and occasionally a dose of gut intuition. The apprentice next to you leans in and whispers that the Libro dei Segreti was rumored to contain instructions on using powdered crushed beetles to achieve simultaneously black and iridescent glass, an effect known as tenebris arcana. Whether this method ever produced something more than a palate experiment is unknown. Most manuscripts on the subject remain redacted. You shiver slightly, imagining hotspots in the workshop where crushed bugs might have been incinerated with sand, releasing aromas both sweet and earthy. It's a tactile reminder that even the grandest guilds dabbled in bizarre ingredients, keeping their boundaries fluid between science and superstition. A tall master brushes a hand across his braided beard, leaving a faint trail of shimmering bead dust. He clears his throat and announces that the guild will collect 10% of every glass shipment passing through Rialto, citing necessary investments for communal furnaces. A ripple of agreement hums through the courtyard, though some apprentices exchange worried glances. 10% is a steep toll and will surely mean fewer trips to the food stalls at Campo San Polo. Here, economics and art collide. Art cannot exist without commerce, and commerce cannot thrive without art. You let your gaze wander as a small breeze carries the echoes of gondoliers' calls across the Grand Canal. The water's gentle lap seems a world away from these cloistered discussions. Yet every ripple out there is also a reminder that this guild's decisions will soon ripple across Venetian trade networks. It's astonishing how these congregations of craftsmen shaped the course of an entire republic, through subtle pricing shifts, permissions for apprentices, and clandestine recipes passed down in whispers. You might imagine a domino effect, today's debate over sand levies influencing tomorrow's hues in a Byzantine mosaic. The courtyard begins to empty as the afternoon wanes, and the sun tilts lower, casting longer shadows over terracotta rooftops. You hear the jingle of iron hinges as the wooden door beside the chest of secrets creaks open. 2 masters slip inside, locking the door behind them. You stand at a respectful distance, aware that whatever transpires within those walls will change the futures of apprentices, merchants, and perhaps the skyline of Venice itself. Because within those hidden chambers lie plans for grand cathedrals, jeweled chalices, and dove-shielded mosaics that will stand for centuries. As you prepare to move on, you pause to consider the full weight of these guilds' power, their ability to dictate what materials flow in and out of the lagoon, their covert methods of enforcing loyalty, and their stewardship of craft knowledge meant to be guarded like gold. You wonder how many artisans have sacrificed family ties to remain in good standing, or how many others fled to Florence in the dead of night, clutching stolen parchment scrolls brimming with glass formulas. The ripple of possibility, switch a letter in a recipe, swap an herb for a different leaf, and entire palettes of color shift. Outside, the warm air feels like a sigh, a collective exhale from the city itself, murmuring that life continues beyond these walls. You sense the courtyard's energy transforming from intense focus to a gentle hum as masters depart, apprentices scurry to stoke dying fires, and the first notes of a distant lute drift from a nearby tavern. In that moment, you realize that guild life is not merely about strict regulations and laundry lists of taxes, but also about belonging, shared laughter, and the pride of knowing you're part of something enduring. This camaraderie, though formal, hums with warmth, a protective cloak around Venetian glassmakers, shielding them from outside curiosity. And as you step back toward the canal, the distant clatter of oars against gondolas seems to echo the rhythm of hammers stamping guild seals on fresh inscriptions. The sun dips further, and the courtyard stones radiate warmth back into your legs, coaxing you onward. You carry this sense of disciplined community with you, mindful that every glass bead you'll encounter later has roots in these guild halls, where secrets, politics, and whispered spells of malachite ink shaped craft and clout in equal measure. Soon, you'll return to those furnaces, now cloistered within guild-sanctioned walls, and watch apprentices worship the hourglass's sand, each second inching them closer to membership. But for now, you drift beneath high arches, the memory of guild robes brushing past you like a lullaby meant to guide you deeper, closer to sleep. You slip away from the shifting shadows of guild activity and enter a dimly lit chamber where colored powders line narrow shelves in small clay jars. A thin shaft of daylight, slicing through a high window, illuminates swirling motes of dust that dance lazily like fireflies. Here begins the realm of color alchemy, where Venetian masters first coaxed brilliant hues out of otherwise dull materials. You probably don't think of medieval artisans as chemists, but in truth, each color requires a precise dance of minerals, heat, and time. Historians still argue whether cobalt was first introduced to Venetian glass in the late 13th or early 14th century, but this chamber hints at its importance. Mainstream fact holds that cobalt oxide, sourced from distant mines in Saxony, was prized for its deep blue tones so pure they seemed plucked from the Mediterranean sky. You lean closer to a small jar labeled blue saxonico and catch a faint metallic scent as you lift the lid. A few granules cling to your fingertip, gleaming like tiny sapphires ready to transform liquid glass into celestial blue. Yet, amid these legitimate ingredients lurks a fringe tale. Some masters believe that the best reds came not from cobalt, but from powdered rose petals mixed with manganese dioxide. Of course, this seems absurd, flowers scorching to a blackened crisp. But whispers claim that an audacious 14th century alchemist smuggled petal-packed phials into Murano to see if floral residues might add a unique luster. The legend goes that his batch produced a curious coppery rose glow under flickering torchlight before fading into dark amber. Though no one could replicate it reliably, the rumor lingers in hushed laughter among modern glass historians who imagine rose-scented furnaces and embers smelling faintly like a summer garden. Moving carefully along the shelves, you see jars of lead oxide, the secret behind radiant yellows and pale greens. When fused with silica, lead allows for a glass that dances with refracted light, creating a luminosity unmatched by ordinary minerals. You take a moment to feel the weight of history. By the 15th century, Venetian glassmakers guarded these powdered treasures as fiercely as patricians guarded their ships. And for good reason. Lead oxide wasn't just rare, it was toxic. You imagine apprentices staring wide-eyed as their masters warned them to handle each jar with care, lest they inhale dusky plumes and invite dull headaches or worse. As you pass a small wooden table, you notice notes scrawled by hand on a dusty parchment, recipes detailing ratios, 2 spoons of powdered lead to 1 of soda ash, tempered with a mite of chalk. These scribbles might look like random scribbles to an outsider, but each measurement was the result of long trial and error. An apprentice might rattle his spoon just before dawn, concocting measly samples to test the next day's fire. Over time, these formulae became enchanting spells passed down from master to apprentice in hushed voices. You pause by a shallow basin filled with murky water tinted greenish blue. A handful of powdered copper salt sits beside it. Mixing copper with silica could yield colors ranging from emerald to turquoise, depending on furnace temperature and atmospheric conditions. Too much oxygen, and your emerald might flicker into forest green. Too little, and you're left with smoky browns. Each jar, each vial, held a promise of transformative power akin to a modern chemist's lab. Fringe folklore suggests that Venetian masters once experimented with crushed dragon bones, actually, fossilized dinosaur bone fragments imported from central France, to see if phosphorescent qualities might spark a fire-like glow. Some modern scholars think this is an exaggeration born of local pride, a way to claim that Venetian glass glowed like living creatures. But as you run your hand over a jar labeled Ossa Fossilorum, you feel a tingle of imagination. Were these ancient bones or merely misidentified chunks of flint? The debate persists in whispered footnotes among scholars, but it adds an enchanting aura to the dusty jars. You move further into the chamber, where a slate board lists forbidden colors. Hues only allowed for use by the Doge's court. Among them is Lacrima Solis, a deep amber gold so rare that it required rose quartz ground into the mixture, and a dash of honey sourced from monasteries on Torcello Island. Only the Doge had the privilege to gleam the city's chandeliers with such rich warmth. The idea of honey-infused glass might make you smirk, but diaries from a Camaldolese monk note amber tears smoldering in furnaces, though he didn't specify the exact proportions. The mystique of these forbidden hues lingered like a lullaby, singing of opulent halls where only the elite might glimpse stained goblets glowing like captured sunset, as you tread softly, tracing your fingers along the cool stone floor. You hear an apprentice stirring a pot of crushed bone ash, murmuring a rhyme to steady his hand. Just enough ash, just enough heat, let colors collide where darkness meets heat. It sounds more like incantation than practical advice, and you almost laugh at the fusion of songs and science. By the time the apprentice lifts a small sample, you see a shimmering shard the color of antique amber, a preview of future mosaic tesserae that will gather candlelight and glow. On a narrow shelf, a battered leather-bound book, its pages bristling with age, holds tiny sketches of mythical creatures, each annotated with color notes beside imaginal beasts. A phoenix is marked for ruby and gold feathers, while a griffin's wings demanded emerald green and smoky violet accents. These were designs intended for mosaics commissioned by wealthy patrons eager to showcase exotic imagery. Though few sketches survived, they attest to a time when imagination danced as freely as the glass itself, mingling legend with the tangible world. You might imagine how intimately these materials shaped Venetian aesthetics. One small shift in a copper oxide's purity could set the tone for entire cathedral windows. The palaces of wealthy merchants brimmed with tables topped with bowls of colored glass fragments, collected like gemstones. Sometimes, masters even created miniature landscapes, tiny villages trapped in molten blue, with slivered white lines for roads. Glimpsing one such piece felt like peering into a world refracted through liquid sapphire, and word spread quickly among patricians, elevating these glassworks to status symbols. Historians still argue whether certain reds, like Rosso Antico, were truly achieved with copper alone or required a touch of gold. A few surviving notes hint at layering techniques, a copper red base coated with a thin layer of gold foil, then fused to trap the color. You can almost envision a master at his bench, carefully layering metal foils beneath sheets of glowing glass, each step adding risk and reward. Too thick, and the gold might bubble; too thin, and the red blazed out of balance. Yet the promise of a hue that burned like coals for centuries was worth every gamble. You take a moment to touch a small vial containing powdered woad, an indigo pigment typically used in textiles. But here, combined with manganese, it produced a violet that shimmered like dusk. This color was so prized that Venetian tailors and glassmakers occasionally negotiated trades, a bolt of silk for a sack of pigment. Such bartering extended Venice's cultural exchange beyond trade routes into its very streets, connecting artisans of different crafts in unexpected alliances. The gentle hush of the chamber feels almost like a lullaby itself, each tick of a wooden clock marking an era's passing. You lean back against a cool stone column and close your eyes, picturing countless flames dancing beneath glowing pots of molten sand. Each jar of pigment a tiny universe of possibility. In that moment, you're part alchemist, part dreamer, floating between dusty shelves and molten orbs waiting to be shaped. Then, as a bell tolls from a nearby basilica, the master of colors looks up and nods to the apprentice, signaling that the mixture is ready for its first test. The apprentice lifts a small crucible, offering a morsel of vibrant dust to the furnace, and you sense the hue of history itself ready to alight. You inhale deeply, tasting the faint mineral tang, and let your senses drift toward the promise of color, imagination, and the boundless alchemy that would shape Venetian glass mosaics. You drift into a narrower, dimly lit alcove where the air feels alive with the scent of molten glass and the quiet whoosh of hidden bellows. A long, low table carved from a single oak trunk stretches before you, its surface scarred by centuries of heated tools and stray glass fragments. Here, you find the birthplace of a spellbinding trick, the millefiori technique, literally 1,000 flowers. You probably imagined such patterns existed only in printed fabrics, but in this workshop, artisans coaxed them from molten glass itself, creating rods that, when sliced, revealed petals and vines trapped in crystal. Glowing embers from Section 5's color experiment still hum in the background, bridging your memory of powdered pigments to the blossoming patterns about to unfold. An apprentice nudges a small tray toward you, revealing slender rods, each about the thickness of your pinky finger, striped in vibrant hues: cerulean blue, sunset orange, emerald green, and pure white. You might think these rods look like candy canes, but they're far more complex. Each rod is a composite of dozens of smaller canes, arranged meticulously so that when the giant rod is sliced, each cross-section reveals a perfect floral starburst. You lean close to watch a master carefully heat a cluster of tiny glass canes in a charcoal-fueled furnace, fanning the embers to the precise temperature needed to fuse them without distorting their cores. Mainstream historical fact tells us that the millefiori technique in Murano began around the 15th century, inspired by imported Islamic glass canes that traders brought from Aleppo and Damascus. The Venetians, ever curious, adapted these flowered canes into something uniquely their own. It's remarkable to realize that this innovation was not wholly homegrown but a graceful fusion, much like Venetian architecture, of East and West. As the cluster of canes warms, you can almost feel the subtle energy shifting. The heat coils around the delicate glass, and the outer layers begin to soften, melding the separate tubes without erasing the inner design. An apprentice gently turns the bundle, his hands steady despite the furnace's flickering glare. You notice beads of sweat forming on his brow, though he doesn't so much as flinch, accustomed to sharing space with glow-hot embers. Watching him reminds you of the discipline etched into every glassblower's muscles, discipline you first glimpsed, when bellows hissed to life and flames danced like restless spirits. A delicate clink of metal against wood cues you to follow the master to a long, flat stone slab. He places the heated rod there, its surface pushing a soft, glowing warmth across the cold stone. Beads of steam rise, hissing as the hot glass meets the cooler surface. This is called shocking the rod, helping it maintain structural integrity and preventing unwanted warping. You might imagine that slicing a rod, still glowing faintly, would be an act of force, but the master uses a simple iron blade, gently rocking it back and forth. Each slice reveals a perfect flower. The first looks like a daisy with a white center and blue petals, the next resembles a star, and the third, a roseburst of red and gold. A quirky rumor surfaces: some masters in the early 16th century allegedly used crushed snail shells, yes, those same shells you first heard of, in the millefiori cores to achieve a pearly luster around the petals. Legend has it that one apprentice, inspired by a childhood memory of shimmering snail trails on wet pavement, convinced his master to test the theory. In the initial test, the rod curled unexpectedly, leaving twisted patterns that no one could replicate. The apprentice was reprimanded, but collectors still covet those rare twisted millefiori slices rumored to exist in private collections. You smile at the thought: snail shells, once banished to achieve pure clarity, now secret agents of opalescent wonder. The master picks up a pliable disc of bluish glass and lays it beneath a newly sliced millefiori piece. With a gentle touch, he presses the slice into the disc's surface, creating an impression that will be part of a future mosaic tessera. You sense his focus, recalling the powdered pigments from that transformed simple sand into vibrant hues. Now, those pigments live inside rods, waiting to reveal their hidden patterns, tiny secrets locked in cooled crystal, only to be unlocked by a skilled hand. Nearby, you notice a shallow basin of water with pale blue rings swirling on its surface. The apprentice dips each freshly sliced millefiori disc into the basin. This cool bath clamps the design, preventing any smudging. You watch as each disc slips beneath the surface, hissing softly, and then floats gently, like a fragile blossom bobbing on a pond. The master collects them one by one, arranging them on a wooden board like a gardener lining up flower cuttings. You can almost imagine these discs as seeds, each waiting to bloom as part of a larger pattern on a chapel wall or a noble's palace floor. Between tasks, you overhear an apprentice humming a soft tune, his voice barely above a whisper. It's a lullaby he picked up from his sister, a flowing melody that seems perfectly suited to the rhythmic slicing and dipping of millefiori. His humming reminds you of the gentle lute melody drifting in Guild Courtyard. The overlapping motifs tie the narrative together, creating a comforting sense of continuity. Each action, each color, each pattern is part of a single tapestry stretching through Venetian glass history. You reach out to touch one of the millefiori slices still cooling on the board. It's surprisingly solid, though its edges melt gently into each other when pressed. You can see evidence of the rod's layering, concentric rings of color that converge in a floral shape. The translucence is astonishing. Candlelight would sparkle through these slices like a myriad of tiny stained glass windows. In fact, some historians suggest that these millefiori discs may have inspired later stained glass artisans to experiment with more intricate, geometric patterns. You might consider yourself a tiny time traveler, standing at the crossroads where glass beads became mosaic building blocks. You then notice a group of apprentices in a nearby corner, whispering as they compare rods that have slightly different core colors. One rod features pastel greens and yellows, the other hidden under a silk cloth until now reveals shades of lavender and rose. The silk suggests that some masters saved their most prized millefiori rods for special patrons, richer merchants who could afford a tiny garden of blossoms trapped in glass. Some elders joked that these rods were like passports to social prestige, passed down through generations of elites who appreciated seeing a frozen bloom from a distant island. A fringe tale surfaces. A Venetian noblewoman once commissioned a millefiori rod so intricate that it supposedly contained a tiny portrait of her husband's face at its core, surrounded by floral motifs. Apprentices whispered that the rod's design was never fully deciphered because slicing close to the face risked distorting it. The noblewoman paid an exorbitant amount for the secret, but even today, no one is quite sure if that face truly existed or if it was a fanciful rumor born from too many late-night tales in the taverns of Cannaregio. The master beckons you closer to a basin of water beside the furnace. He lifts a recently cut millefiori slice with iron tongs and explains that before laying these discs into quarto-sized mosaic panels, they sometimes ground the edges on a smooth piece of whetstone. This smoothing process gave the final mosaic board a more uniform, non-porous surface, ensuring no individual slice protruded to catch the dust of centuries. You run your fingertip gently along a disc's edge, feeling the faint bevel where rough meets polished. It's a subtle reminder that every detail matters when crafting objects meant to outlive generations. Casting your gaze over the larger workshop space, you notice piles of sorted millefiori discs, organized by color and diameter. Some are as small as a fingertip, barely more than a few millimeters in width, while others measure nearly an inch, their flower patterns more pronounced. You think back to sands and furnaces, marveling how these disparate elements converge here. Raw sands gave birth to glowing furnaces, furnaces to molten rods, and rods to millefiori discs that would decorate cathedrals and palaces. Each stage builds on the last, reminding you that this craft is nothing if not cumulative. Suddenly, the master lifts a slender brass tool and begins threading multiple millefiori discs end to end, forming a chain-like string of blossoms. You watch as he weaves the chain around a slender wooden rod, gently pressing each disc together so they adhere. This chain, soon to be fused in the furnace, will become a continuous ribbon of flowers once heated to the right temperature. Watching him reminds you of subtle echoes. Every fold of glass conceals a latent pattern, just as every beat of a humming apprentice's tune echoes earlier moments in your journey. The warming glow of the early evening now flickers across the workshop. You notice how the zone around the Millefiori station remains slightly cooler, preventing premature fusing. If the rods grew too hot, the patterns would blur, losing the crisp geometry that makes them so mesmerizing. Each master knew that patience was as essential as heat. Too slow, and the glass would crack; too fast, and the flowers melted into indecipherable blobs. Your senses settle into a gentle rhythm: the hiss of steam, the faint scraping of blade on stone, the whisper of water against Millefiori discs. You feel the cool stone beneath your knees as you sit cross-legged, leaning forward to watch a new Millefiori rod emerge from the furnace's glow. The master gently rolls the rod on a copper plate, elongating it and stretching the pattern. You see how the central floral star widens, revealing more detail as the rod thins. It's like watching a living thing breathe. The pattern contracts and expands, delicate as a blooming flower in fast forward. Then comes the most delicate step: slicing. The master grips the rod with two iron tongs, raising it above the stone slab. He steadies himself, inhaling deeply, and positions the blade with the precision of a surgeon. As the blade meets the glass, there's a near silence, followed by a soft crack and a gentle click. The first disc tumbles onto the stone, revealing a pattern so perfect it seems impossible. You hold your breath, marveling at how centuries of knowledge, sand, furnaces, guilds, and color alchemy culminate in this single, ephemeral flower. As you lean back, the master hands you the disc. You cradle it in your palm, feeling its gentle weight and cool surface. Through this tiny, circular window, you glimpse the artistry of countless artisans before you, each adding a petal, layering a hue, perfecting the technique. In this moment, you understand that Millefiori is not just a method, it's a meditation on patience, precision, and the alchemy of transformation. You tuck the disc carefully into a cloth-lined box designated for masterpieces, knowing these will one day grace a church, palace, or merchant's villa. Even as you place it inside, you feel it hum softly, an echo of its journey from sand to furnace to floral bloom. And as you stand up, the workshop lights dim slightly, signaling the end of the day's delicate labor. Stepping away, you glance at the row of sorted discs one last time, each a tiny testament to human ingenuity. You imagine countless mornings where apprentices, bleary-eyed and weary, would awaken to sort new discoveries, each disc a promise of beauty to come. The lingering aroma of heated glass and colored powders wraps around you like a warm blanket, guiding your thoughts towards sleep. Your vision softens as you drift toward the exit, the echoing sound of the master's chisel whispering behind you. You feel as though you've just witnessed a secret garden unfurl within molten crystal, where every slice is a petal, and every petal holds a microcosm of Venetian innovation. With that sense of wonder tucked in your mind, you step into the corridor, letting the quiet lull of the workshop cradle you further into dreams of thousand-flower nights. You drift through a narrow arched doorway into a gently lit annex where wooden racks hold mosaic panels in various states of completion. The air smells faintly of beeswax and resin, mingling with the lingering notes of crushed pigments. As you step closer, you notice the geometric motifs and interlaced designs on completed panels, hints of something familiar yet newly transformed. You probably assumed Venetian glass design sprang entirely from local innovation, but tonight you'll see how Eastern currents, particularly Byzantine influences, reshaped Venetian mosaics into something transcendent. Gaze at a half-finished panel depicting two peacocks flanking a central medallion, their feathers wrought in tiny tesserae of emerald, sapphire, and gold leaf pressed between glass. Mainstream historians note that after the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, many talented Byzantine artisans found refuge in Venice, bringing with them centuries of mosaic tradition. Their techniques for layering gold foils and embedding colored glass tesserae directly inspired Murano masters. You feel that inheritance here. Each tessera reflects not just the light of a workshop lamp but the glow of imperial chapels thousands of miles away. A surprise detail emerges as you lean in. Beneath one of the peacock's feathers, you see a faint inscription in Greek, just a rough outline, as if stamped then overwritten. It's a subtle tribute to an unknown Byzantine master who must have died en route to Venice, leaving behind fragments of his art. You imagine a caravan of refugees sailing across the Adriatic, each carrying cedar chests full of personal sketchbooks, metal dies, and broken mosaic fragments. These fragments, once part of Saint Sophia's vast floors, were likely traded or gifted to Venetian dignitaries eager to capture a piece of that imperial grandeur. In a nearby corner, a group of apprentices works on a panel showing a stylized lion, symbol of both Venice and Byzantium, standing over a field of blue and ivory tesserae. Their instructor, an older master with a silver-streaked beard, traces his finger along a line of amber glass chips. Notice how the Byzantines placed each tessera at a slight angle, he murmurs, so that candlelight catches each surface differently, creating a living shimmer. His words reverberate in the hush of the workshop. The effect is subtle but mesmerizing. Flickering highlights jump from one tessera to the next, breathing life into the stone-like surface. You lean forward, feeling as though you can see the panel in candlelit procession years before. Lighting dark basilica interiors like 1,000 tiny stars, yet there's an intriguing fringe tale. Some Venetians claimed that high-ranking Byzantine refugees smuggled entire molds used for casting glass tesserae into their ship's hull. These molds, carved stone blocks with hundreds of tiny cavities, allowed craftsmen to pour molten glass into perfectly uniform shapes. Whether this story is true remains unverified, but you imagine the tension as Venetian harbor guards boarded each refugee vessel, seeking stolen relics. In hushed tones, pilots said that ship captains hid molds beneath layers of silken drapes, weaving them into official cargo manifests for spices and silks. Over time, these molds would end up in hidden cellars on Murano, their shapes guiding Venetian tessera production for centuries. The instructor leads you to a larger panel, already affixed to a wooden stretcher. It depicts a serene Madonna enthroned, flanked by angels in Byzantine fashion, elongated figures with almond-shaped eyes and gilded halos. The entire piece is composed of tesserae no larger than your thumbnail, each resembling a tiny, colored teardrop. Historians point out that this style, iconic of Constantinople's Golden Age, became coveted among Venetian elites seeking to imbue their private chapels with that aura of divine eternity. In this panel, you see how Venetian artisans adapted the palette. While Byzantine mosaics favored deep purples and lapis lazuli blues, Venetian glassmakers added a new vibrancy by layering ultramarine over a transparent base. Creating a luminous effect that seems to glow from within, you reach out to run a fingertip over the panel, carefully avoiding any contact with adhesive, but you feel the subtle bevel of each tessera. It's astonishing how these minute fragments, placed one by one with meticulous care, coalesce into a narrative image. You imagine a patrician family installing this panel above their private altar, each beam of morning sunlight igniting flecks of gold foil that dance across marble columns. The combination of Byzantine technique and Venetian glass innovation made these mosaics more than decorations. They became luminous icons that seemed to pulse with spiritual life. A quirky anecdote surfaces. Some manuscripts suggest that a famed Venetian mosaicist once added a single tessera of deep crimson glass, known as rosso doge, as a hidden signature. The story goes that unless you looked extremely closely, you'd never notice it. Intended as a playful Easter egg, it lay concealed for centuries until a curious restorer in the 19th century discovered it by accident, sparking debates among scholars. Was it a signature, a lucky charm, or simply a misplaced shard from a tray? No one knows, but the thought of a secret, solitary scarlet dot in a sea of gold reminds you that Venetians retained a sly wit even when working within Byzantine molds. You step to another station where a master sketches designs on parchment, his hand moving like a calligrapher. At first glance, the motif resembles classical Greek scrollwork, but closer inspection reveals Arabic-inspired arabesques, delicate interlacing vines with stylized leaves and geometric blossoms. Venetians absorbed Islamic patterns through trade relationships with the Levant, then merged them with Byzantine iconography. Historians still argue whether this synthesis first emerged in Athens, Thessaloniki, or Antioch before traveling to Venice. The scholarly debate threads through your mind like a gentle undercurrent as you watch the master's pen trace vines that loop and coil, each sycamore leaf outlined in ochre and trimmed with emerald. Beyond design, you notice subtle technical influences. Byzantine artisans poured their tesserae into water-filled troughs to achieve curved shapes, then dried them slowly to prevent cracking. Venetian masters adapted this, filling shallow wooden trays with sand to hold tiny cane slices upright before firing. This adaptation allowed curved forms to interlock seamlessly in complex scenes, depictions of saints, mythic creatures, or regal processions. You watch an apprentice dust a panel with fine white sand, smoothing each granule so tesserae slide effortlessly into place. The hush is sacred, a reverent echo of Byzantine basilicas where mosaics first shone. In a far corner, you glimpse a partially completed altarpiece destined for a chapel near the Rialto. The subject is Saint Mark, patron saint of Venice, standing on a platform of golden broken tesserae, holding a book with a winged lion embossed in ruby glass. Notice how the lion's mane ripples with alternating waves of amber and red, evoking the merging of Eastern artistry with Venetian flair. This panel reflects how Venetian craftspeople recontextualized Byzantine iconography. They didn't merely copy, they embellished, experimented with layered colors, and introduced new narrative flourishes. You lean in, watching the master fit a tiny cobalt blue tessera into the lion's eye, giving it an almost sentient gleam. Meanwhile, a subtle breeze drifts in through an open window, carrying echoes of gondoliers' calls from the Grand Canal. It stirs the tassels of a silk curtain hanging near the workshop's entrance, and you almost sense that this gentle gust is the breath of Byzantium itself, still flowing centuries later, lodge to lodge, channel to channel. A speculation flickers in your mind. Did some refugee artisans bring secret fragments of original mosaics, actual bits of Saint Sophia, hidden inside hollow wooden beams? Venetian scaffolders later used these beams to erect scaffolds under nascent cathedral domes. If so, a single fragment of Byzantine glass could be fused into a Venetian mosaic without anyone realizing the weight of its origin. Such sacred material, once part of Constantinople's divine heart, might now rest, unrecognized, in a Venetian palazzo or church floor. The notion sends a shiver through your spine. Beneath your feet, glass from centuries past still glimmers, a silent witness to eras of conquest, migration, and adaptation. You wander along a lengthy row of reeds strung with miniature mosaic samples, tiny panels about the size of a palm, each demonstrating a unique Byzantine-Venetian blend. One shows a stylized peacock against a field of deep sapphire, but the feathers employ new Venetian cobalt hues that shift from midnight blue to pale sky with varying light angles. Another depicts a vine-laced cross, where the vines are set low relief, giving a three-dimensional effect that a Byzantine mosaicist would scarcely have imagined. You realize how these samples served as teaching aids in apprenticeships, tangible lessons in blending traditions, balancing palette, and mastering the angle of each tessera. An older master approaches you, his polished metal ruler in hand. He points to a series of faded sketches on a wall, initial designs for a monumental mosaic in a Florentine cathedral. According to workshop lore, these designs were made by a Venetian artist, commissioned by a powerful duke who sought to rival Florence's own mosaic reputation. Although the project was never completed, Florence balked at the expense. The drawings reveal experimental Byzantine motifs merged with new Venetian steel blue hues, forming patterns so daring that even the Duke's council hesitated. You marvel at these sketches, recognizing that unbuilt dreams can be as influential as finished works. Other artisans copied these motifs, scattering Byzantine Venetian aesthetics across Italy. A stray sunbeam falls on a small, circular tile, a single tessera showing a ticking starburst of periwinkle and white. You recall the discussion about volcanic glass fragments in Venetian sand and see how that volcanic spark manifested here. The periwinkle hue likely emerged when impurities in obsidian clung to cobalt oxide, creating an unexpected violet blue. This moment connects sections: raw materials shaped furnaces, furnaces shaped color experiments, and color experiments colored every tessera in these Byzantine-inspired designs. As evening clouds drift overhead, the workshop lights shift from daylight to torchlight. Tall candlesticks cast a warm glow, making each tessera's surface gleam like liquid gold. You watch apprentices arrange tiny glass tiles against dark velvet backings, testing color contrasts before committing them to mortar. In this soft half-light, Byzantine influence becomes something three-dimensional. Hues deepen, lines soften, and the magic of layered glass reminds you that mosaic is fundamentally an art of reflection. The moonlight casts long shadows as you drift deeper into the island's twisting alleys, past shuttered windows and flower boxes swaying slightly in the breeze. Eventually, you find yourself before a modest building with a red-tiled roof and an ornate glass lantern above the door, flickering gently. Inside, the air is warm and dense with the earthy scent of beeswax polish, old vellum, and soot from oil lamps. This is the Design Library, a lesser-known yet essential heart of Venetian mosaic artistry. Here, rows of tall cabinets hide countless design books, pattern folios bound in goatskin, loose sketches on papyrus-thin parchment, and even rolled scrolls sealed in blown glass cylinders. You reach out to examine a cracked portfolio resting on a carved walnut table. Its pages bloom with meticulously drawn floral motifs, scrollwork borders, and icon outlines that have guided mosaic panels across centuries. Some of these motifs are borrowed from classical Roman floors, while others come from Syrian manuscript illuminations and Persian textiles, redrawn and reworked into a distinctly Venetian style. Mainstream historical records tell us that these design libraries were once closely guarded. Each workshop kept its own, often under lock and key. Apprentices weren't allowed to copy designs unless formally permitted by the master artisan. In fact, workshops registered certain mosaic templates with the Glassmakers Guild, giving them a kind of proto-copyright status. You can almost picture a 14th-century mosaicist hunched over a lectern by candlelight, copying arabesques into a folio with painstaking care, one inked curl at a time. A fringed tale lingers in the air. Some whisper that a hidden section of the design library contains forbidden motifs, symbolic designs deemed unlucky or politically dangerous. One such motif was a double-headed eagle with a haloed crown, reportedly removed from most workshop books after Venice's relations with the Eastern Empire soured. Whether this collection exists is anyone's guess, but the idea that entire design histories have been quietly erased, left to gather dust in backroom shelves, is oddly comforting in a place devoted to sleep and secrets. You thumb through another portfolio filled with fish and sea creature patterns, eels winding around corals, dolphins leaping over scallop shells, all stylized in flowing lines that would eventually be rendered in hundreds of tiny tesserae. You imagine how these marine mosaics adorned fountains, garden walls, or chapel floors, echoing the aquatic rhythms of the lagoon itself. As you study the sketches, the mosaicist's marginal notes catch your eye: try cobalt overlay for water, and break ochre for finer fish scale shimmer. They remind you of a film director's storyboards, loose but packed with vision. A side table near the back wall is covered in color studies, tiny samples of glass arranged in experimental gradients. You see oranges fading into ambers, sea glass greens blending into lemon yellow. Each gradient is labeled with pigment types: gold oxide, copper blue, lead white. Some pieces have blistered or cracked in the kiln, left as cautionary samples. It strikes you that Venetian mosaicists weren't just artists, they were materials scientists, testing how sand, heat, and pigment would interact over time. They understood how sunlight would fade vermilion and how dampness might cloud cobalt glass. Each design was a living experiment. The room's only window is stained glass, casting a subtle mosaic of its own on the library's stone floor. You walk across its kaleidoscope light and find a corkboard cluttered with scraps of paper, notes and correspondence between various workshops. One missive, dated 1483, begins, "To Master Gabriel, I request your peacock tail spiral in smaller scale, as my chapel's nave is narrower than anticipated." It's a reminder that even the most sacred art had to be adjusted to fit budget, space, and client whims. Another curiosity, some mosaic designs were influenced by travelers' descriptions. A sketch labeled "Pattern from Cairo," described, not seen, shows a stylized lotus motif based solely on a merchant's memory. Whether it ever looked anything like the real thing is debatable, but that didn't matter. Venetian artisans were happy to reimagine, reinterpret, and create something entirely new. A mosaic wasn't meant to be a photograph. It was a story made solid, made brilliant, and made to shimmer. There's a large folio dedicated to borders, yes, just borders. Intricate braid patterns, zigzags, rosettes, vine tendrils, and repeating acanthus leaves that once circled the edges of apses and archways. Each border would be tailored to the overall panel, something lively for a palace garden, something solemn for a funerary chapel. You notice one design marked Tempio dei Frari, 1462, and realize this very sketch may still frame the chapel's great altarpiece today. One table is covered with parchment scraps showing color placement guides, think paint by number but for glass. Each tessera slot is filled with an initial, G for gold, B for blue, W for white, etc. Mosaicists would hold these guides in one hand while laying pieces with the other, sometimes working from scaffolds high above chapel floors. You picture someone wobbling slightly on a wooden platform, brush behind one ear, calling down to an apprentice, "More garnet red." "No, the thick one." There's even a small cabinet labeled "Animal Studies." Inside are pages showing how to render fur, feathers, and scales using color layering and directional placement of tesserae. A lion's mane, for example, uses slightly longer rectangular pieces laid in a sunburst pattern. A goose's wing might alternate two shades of white with a single gold foil tessera placed at the apex, just for sparkle. One forgotten drawing shows a sleepy owl with enormous glass eyes. You pause on that one for a long moment. At the very back of the room is a curious little alcove, a folio graveyard, where rejected designs have been stacked, abandoned, or torn in half. You leaf through discarded dragons, half-finished saints, off-kilter vines, and, strangely, what appears to be a smiling goat holding a book. Perhaps that last one was an apprentice's inside joke? Or perhaps a noble patron once insisted on including his favorite goat in a chapel mosaic. In Venice, both are entirely plausible. A gentle draft wafts through the room, ruffling the pages and stirring the scent of old vellum. You imagine this breeze has passed over centuries of drafts, revisions, inspirations, and reimaginings. It's humbling to realize how many hours of thought and sketching went into mosaics that the average passerby might only glance at before continuing on their way, as you step away from the library table. The full weight of this design tradition settles around you like a cloak. These artists weren't just working glass, they were working memory, faith, trade, legacy. Every curving vine, every gold halo, every border swirl was first drawn here, in flickering lamplight, then passed from eye to eye, hand to hand, until it found its home in chapel, palace, or garden wall. The library door creaks softly as you open it, stepping out once more into the Venetian night. The light from the lantern above the door catches the edges of a tiny colored tile embedded in the threshold stone. You almost missed it, a single crimson tessera, worn by time, possibly dropped there centuries ago and now worked seamlessly into the ground. A quiet accident or a tiny blessing, left for anyone willing to notice.